Welcome. In this video, I'm going to be replacing the oil pan gasket on this 2006 Honda Odyssey. So I want to say I'm not an expert on this. I'm just sharing my experience. Now, the first thing I did is I actually drove this up on ramps, and then later I jacked it up. I jacked it up by this jack point here, and I put stands under either side pinch weld on either side of the car. I left the ramps kind of in place. I had to push them back a little bit. So I have this up in the air. Now the factory service manual says the first thing you need to do is remove this plastic here. I'm going to the next step, which is to remove the exhaust. If I can't get the exhaust off, I don't want the car tore half apart. So there's going to be an exhaust flange on the front and the back side of the engine. And then right down here, there's also a hanger. These are supposed to be 14 millimeter nuts. So I have a 14 millimeter socket here. And if I put this on here, it's pretty loose. So what I ended up doing is taking a 13 millimeter and I hammered that on with a brass hammer, and that's an impact socket. And then I used an impact wrench and I was able to get that off. But there's a good chance you'll snap this or round over the nut. There are a number of different ways to get this off. Now I did spray this twice with PB Blaster over the last couple days. Some people will use heat. I have a lot of oil around here, so I don't feel comfortable doing that right now. Now, if you have a little inductive heater thing, you could use that. Another thing you could potentially do is take a Dremel and very carefully cut the nut. Oftentimes, you don't even have to cut it all the way. If you cut it partially, it will make it easier to remove. Now, that will create sparks, so I'm guessing that probably wouldn't catch oil on fire, but it could catch other things on fire, so be careful if you do that method. Now, I did measure. These are M10 1.25 thread pitch. So I'm just going to get some new nuts to replace these with. So I'm not going to film taking all of these nuts off. I'll share the results when I'm done, but I'm going to try sharing taking at least one off here. So we'll see. Okay, so I couldn't get the 13 to work on there, and then I tried the 14 and it rounded over, so I'll have to come back to that one. See if I can get this other one here. Okay, I think I got that one bottomed out a little better. Okay, so that one did not want to come loose. I'm not going to continue filming, but I will let you know what technique worked to get it off. Okay, so I got the nuts off in the front. I threaded them back on a little bit. And I got the ones in the back of the engine. These back here, I'm having a lot of trouble with. So I had said I had pounded a 13 millimeter socket on here. On the back ones, I actually pounded a 12 millimeter on there. And the 12 is almost loose on these flange bolts. The bolts are severely corroded. So I took the hanger bracket out with 14 millimeter socket. So I'm going to see if I can just kind of drop the exhaust and kind of have it partially hang. But I'm going to try and crack it loose. So I might need to get a chisel in there to kind of separate that. So I need to remove this plastic now. So I'm just going to pull all of the plugs and take this off. So to pull these pins out, I'm using these Performance Tool pliers. Just put them on either side. And we'll squeeze. And then we can pull those pins out. So I'm just going to pull out all of the pins until this thing drops out. Okay, so I have the plastic off. I put a chisel in on the side here and tapped it. I used like a cold chisel, and I was able to split this open. And I took these bolts off, and I was able to pull this down here. I was able to pull this down here, and I was able to kind of pull it out of the way. I don't know if I'll be able to pull it out of the way enough to get this off, but I'm going to try it. Lucky for you, you'll know after I do it if it worked. So the next step will be to drain the oil out of here. So the plug is right here. That's 17 millimeter. It's pretty straightforward. You put a pan down, you take that out. Now you'll want a new crush washer to put that back in. You'll also want oil, and you're also going to take the oil filter off. So I'm going to let that drain. That may be all I'm going to do for today. Of course, I'm not going to make you wait a whole day to continue the video. So when I come back, we'll have the oil drain and we'll continue on. Okay, it's the next morning, and I wanted to say on one of the flanges, the stud actually came out. The nut was stuck to this where it wouldn't come off. So what I did is I took this and I put it in a vise on this bulged area here, and I used a Dremel. This is a different nut, but I used a Dremel to cut across this, and I took some channel locks and I was able to remove this, and then I took a M10 1.25 tap and just chased the threads a little bit. Now you can also just get a replacement of this part. So when I put this back together, I'll have to thread that back in. So back under here, I'm going to talk about what I'm going to do. I'm not going to show it all. It should be pretty straightforward. It's minus 20 degrees out right now. I'm in an attached garage, but it's not heated. I have a little heater going next to me, but I'm going to try and work somewhat quickly. But there's two bolts here. There's one here, and there's one up here. You want to take those out. Those are 10 millimeter. Then there's one here and here. These two larger bolts are 14 millimeter. Once you get that plate off of there, you're going to have 10 millimeter all around the oil pan. So you want to loosen all of those, take almost all of them out. I would leave a couple in to hold it up while you pry it off, and there will be oil in there, so you'll want to have some cardboard or something down to catch that. Now I did put the drain plug back in over here for now, but I'm going to take this off. I'll pull the exhaust down to pull it out, and I'll let you know if I had any trouble doing that. Okay, so I've cracked all the bolts loose on the oil pan, and I did pull the exhaust down about this far from the front, I don't know, maybe 6 inches, and that's just to access the bolts. I still have to remove the bolts and get the pan out, so I'll report back on how that goes. Okay, I got the pan off. A couple things to point out is there is this bracket. Let's see if I can get zoomed in on it. The bracket, it's right in the middle of the screen. So that I think was a 12 millimeter connecting into the oil pan, but I did have to loosen up the other end, and that I think was 11 millimeter. It was kind of corroded. I had to hammer a socket on there. It took a while to get off. I actually gave up on loosening it while I took the oil pan loose, but I did have to loosen it to get the pan out. At least I think I did. But I was able to pull the exhaust down and pull it out the front. Now when I put it back in, I have to be careful that after I put the gasket on it, that I don't smear it on the bottom of the pickup here. So now that I have it off, I'm going to clean up where the gasket was on the engine, and I'll do the same on the oil pan here. There's not a lot of gasket on the oil pan, and it was very thin, and actually if you read the service manual, you're just supposed to put a thin bead on anyway. There wasn't a tremendous amount of oil in the oil pan either. I was a little concerned that when I take it off, it would spill oil because there'd be pockets in there. There was maybe half a cup or less. So I'm going to get this cleaned up, and then we'll try and get it reinstalled. Okay, so I'm down here in my basement. Now I degreased this. Now I didn't get every single bit off, like there's some back here, but I think I did pretty good. I did both sides. Now the gasket mating surface here, I cleaned that with the gasket scraper, and then I took some green Scotch-Brite and some acetone, and I cleaned that all the way around. I wanted it to be very smooth. I got rid of any burrs. There was gasket material sometimes stuck to the side. I pulled that off because I don't want that to flip up and get on the surface. Let me flip this real quick. So here we have the back side, or the underside. Now what I've done here is I've numbered these. So I'm going to pan across this so you can see what the numbers are. So that's the order you're supposed to torque it down. Instead of looking back at the factory service manual every 2 seconds, I just wrote it on here with a Sharpie. I also cleaned up the screws here. So there are short and long screws. I'll show you where those go in a second. But one thing I want to point out is a lot of these screws had a nub of gasket maker on the tip. So I made sure to pull that off when I was cleaning these. And I didn't get these perfect. I just wanted to get them somewhat clean. Now, if you clean these with degreaser and water, what you can do is rinse them off with alcohol and then dry them. And that should keep them from rusting. Although I don't think this coating would rust, but it's good practice nonetheless. Now if we look on the oil pan here, you can keep track of where the longer screws go, but it's pretty easy to tell just looking at this. You can see this is thicker here, here, but then here it's thinner. So where it's thicker, take the longer bolts, thinner, take the shorter bolts. So now let's take a look under the car. Okay, so now we're under the car. You can see where the oil pan will go. So I did the same thing here. I cleaned it with some Scotch-Brite and acetone. This is where we're going to be applying the gasket maker. So we want this very clean. You want both sides clean, obviously. So I made sure to clean it really good all the way around. Now there's not going to be any gasket maker on this surface here, but I did wipe it down a little bit. The gasket will go up this way. Okay, so for the next step, I need to install the gasket maker. So in the factory service manual, they're telling you to use something like Honda Bond. I'm going to be using this Permatex Ultra Gray. So in the factory service manual, it says put a bead in this location on the engine block, and there are time limits, either 4 or 5 minutes, depending on the gasket maker you use. Now with this one, it says apply a continuous bead of 1/16 inch to 1/4 inch, 2 to 6 millimeter to one surface. It says surrounding all bolt holes. Factory service manual does not show you surrounding the bolt holes. And then you're supposed to assemble the parts finger tight until the material starts to squeeze out around the flange. Then you wait an hour, and then you tighten with the torque sequence. On this one, you just tighten it with the torque sequence right away. And that's the sequence here I looked at. And the torque value for this is going to be 8.7 foot-pounds. So I'm going to apply the gasket maker. I'm not going to film a lot of video because I want to be somewhat expedient with this, get this up. Then I'll hand tighten it, I'll wait the hour, and then I'll torque it in the order I put the numbers on the oil pan. I forgot to also mention there are locating pins on this side of the oil pan. So you want to make sure these are lined up on the engine block. So I'm going to deviate from the factory service manual by putting the gasket maker on the oil pan itself. If you look at the mating surface on the engine block, it's a lot wider here. So you could potentially accidentally put the gasket sealer where it would go along this area as opposed to here. The downside of doing this is when I put it back in, I could accidentally wipe some of this off, so I'll have to be very careful. Okay, so I have the oil pan on. It went on pretty smoothly. I just held it in place with one hand and got a couple of the bolts started, and I hand tightened them, and then came back an hour later and torqued them all down. And then I replaced these bolts here and these bolts here for this cover plate. So now I have to get the exhaust back on, and the torques on those, I took that bracket off. I'm not seeing the torque on the bracket here, but I do have the torques for the exhaust flanges. And the front is 40 foot-pounds, the rear is 16, and then if you can get it off at the catalytic converter, it's 25. So I thought that was interesting, it had different torques for the front and back. Now I put the oil plug back in, I put the old one in. My handwriting's not good here. But that was on a different page, but that's 39 Newton meters or 29 foot-pounds. So I'm going to swap out that oil plug and I'm going to put a new crush gasket in. But I want to talk about the gaskets on the exhaust flange. So I picked these up at Napa. Now this is for the iVTEC engine. I don't know if the regular engine takes these same ones, but they look like this. But I went to one auto parts store and these were 3 times the cost they were at Napa. I'm not going to give prices. You can look those up on your own, but don't overpay for these things. And then I went to the hardware store and I got these flange nuts. These are M10 1.25 and they have the scalloping on the bottom. So I went to auto parts store. They had to order these or were out. I actually had to go to a couple different hardware stores to find these even. But I'll put a link below online where you can just order these too. Most people will find that easier. I did have a stud come out. So what I did is I took 2 of those nuts and I jammed them against each other on the stud. And then I used a wrench to tighten that in. I did put a little blue Loctite on there. I don't think it's going to make a difference, but I had it. And I just tightened that till it's tight. And then I'm going to torque down the nut when I put it on. So I'll have to loosen up that jam nut. I'll use 1 wrench on the top, 1 on the bottom. So I used a 14 millimeter and a 9/16 wrench that fit on it for the purposes. I didn't want to put the scallop sides towards each other because I was worried they'd lock onto each other. And now the thing I really wanted to talk about, if I can get it on camera here, is this gasket. This is sideways right now, I apologize. This was a bear to get out of here, but I found a trick. I should have done this from the start, is you spray a little bit of PB Blaster or some other penetrant in there and it will loosen it up and it will come out. When I first started trying to remove it, I was using a pick tool and it was just crumbling. I put the penetrating oil on there, waited an hour, and the whole thing just came out. And I had started on the front. On the rear, I didn't have as much access, but I learned from the front one. I sprayed that penetrating oil on there, and I did have to jam a pick tool in the side. You have to get under it, which is a little tricky. So I used a pick tool and a little screwdriver, and once I was able to get it open a little bit, I was able to pry it all out in one piece. And that's right here. So I'll put those new gaskets in here. As far as I can tell, the split part goes up. I'm not 100% sure it matters, but that's the way I'm going to install it. So once that's done, I'm going to put an oil filter back on. I'll refill it with oil, run the engine a bit, and check for leaks. And then I'll replace all of the plastic trim on the front. So that's changing the oil pan gasket on this 2006 Honda Odyssey. Now this wasn't a comprehensive video, but maybe there are some little tips or something I shared in this video that will be helpful. But if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. If you like this video, please click like. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, I'd appreciate if you could do that. And thanks for watching. Until next time, goodbye.